Okay, hello, welcome. My name's Elizabeth McKinstry. I'm a reference librarian here at Springfield City Library. And I cannot tell you how excited we are when Ed Cohen came to us with the opportunity to host this exhibit, significantly of photographs around James Baldwin's 60th birthday at UMass Amherst and Amherst College. I should say right up front that this exhibit and today's reception are supported through a grant from the Springfield Cultural Council, which is a local agency of the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and a grant from Monson Savings Bank, as well as the Springfield City Library. Ed's going to talk a little bit, and then Professor Thelwell. I'm going to introduce Ed, and then Ed's going to go. Ed is a Springfield-based freelance photographer who's been photographing in the Pioneer Valley since 1975. He attended UMass Amherst and received a degree in communication studies with a concentration in Afro-American and Diversity in communications. Ed, aside from being a well-known and beloved figure in Springfield, lo these many years, is also a published author, an exhibition curator, and an accomplished photographer of political demonstrations, musical, and community events. He has participated and captured many monumental moments in time for the city of Springfield and the surrounding area, and he takes pride in presenting diversity in his imagery. Ed, would you like to come on up?
Sure. So I'll do the best. I'm not really a public speaker, so I'll do the best I can. So I had the honor of being given permission to take photos at James Baldwin's birthday celebration in August of 1984. The photo negatives had been sitting in my photo archive since then. I had edited several of the negatives of James Baldwin and his close friend Maya Angelou at several photo exhibits and included them in a photo book that I published in 2020. When I lost all my photo work in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, I had time to work on scanning other negatives from the birthday events to create a photo book, eventually to create a photo exhibit of the birthday party events. James Baldwin remains an important figure because of his activism around racial and sexual discrimination as literary genius. I felt it was a great time to have an event to feature the photos to generate a discussion about James Baldwin and the issues that he was passionate about. I'd like to thank everyone who helped me make this event possible, members of the UMass Afro-Am department who allowed me to take photos at the birthday parties and other events. Springfield Cultural Council for giving me a grant to cover the costs of producing the exhibit. UMass Professor Emeritus Michael Thelwell for coming to speak about James Baldwin, and Ayanna Pierre Maxwell for converting my 1978 photo of James Baldwin at the UMass commencement to a beautiful work of art. The people at New England J. Clay and Michelson's Gallery for printing, matting, and draw mounting the photos. Mary Custer and Teresa Cooper Gordon for helping me with some of the names of the people in photos. Daniel Moriarty, president of Monson Savings Bank, for giving me a grant to cover some of the costs of the especially to Elizabeth McKinstry and her team for helping produce the event, including Jamila Medina Nova, the community relations coordinator, who created the beautiful poster and flyer and writing the press release, and the others who helped the others who helped me with this project. If I forget to mention someone, it's a failure of the mind and not the heart. Thanks again for coming to celebrate James Baldwin. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Professor Thelwell. Let me see if I find it here. So, Ekweme Michael Thelwell, a pioneer in Afro-American studies, 1970, Ekweme Michael Thelwell became the founding chairman of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department at UMass Amherst. The Jamaican Board writer, activist, educator, and intellectual received his early education at Jamaica College. He came to the United States in 1959 to attend Howard University, went on to do graduate work at the University of Mass in Amherst. Professor Thelwell was active in the civil rights movement, participating in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. His anti-apartheid activism in the 1980s resulted in successful legislation that outlawed tax write-offs for U.S.-based corporations paying taxes to the apartheid regime in South Africa. As a writer of fiction as well as of influential essays, his work has been published nationally and internationally in journals and magazines including The Black Scholar, Temps Moderne, the Partisan Review, Presence Africaine, Paris, New York Times, African Commentary. His novel, The Harder They Come, has become a classic on life among Jamaican common folk. His political and literary essays are collected in Duties, Pleasures, and Conflicts, 1987. Thelwell's literary awards include Fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation, National Endowment of the Arts, and Centennial Medal of the Institute of Jamaica. So without further ado, Professor Emeritus Michael Thelwell.
Good afternoon. There's an old blues song that Jimmy was very partial to, which has the line, "Don't start me talking, I'll tell you everything I know." That might be your misfortune here today, because it's very hard not to talk at great length about James Baldwin, one of the few literary geniuses this country ever produced, and the most consequential and significant public intellectual, ranking with Dr. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. And what I want to talk about today, because our time is a little limited, is how I first met him, his origins, and his extraordinary courage. I first met Jimmy when I was a sophomore at Howard University. I don't want to tell you how many years ago that was. But the first thing that was ever said to me about Jimmy remains true and is so expressive and clear in the clarity of his truth that 40 years later I remember it. And I remember who said it to me. Tom Cohen was a very interesting student at Howard. He was one of the 2 or 3 white students there. And he was a close associate of Bayard Rustin in New York. And Tom was very political. And he knew Jimmy from New York, and Jimmy was coming. And he came to me and said, "Mike, does the name Jimmy Baldwin mean anything to you?" And in 1962, I could have been forgiven if it hadn't. But I said, yeah, isn't he a writer? And Tom said, "Yes, you're absolutely correct. And you're going to get a chance to meet him. And he's going to be one of the strangest people you ever met." I said, "Strange?" He said, "He's a very funny-looking little black man, and his eyes bug out," which is true. And he says, "But when he opens his mouth to talk, you will be engulfed in a wave of eloquence and intelligence that you can't imagine." And that was true. And he's extraordinarily courageous as a writer in his public posture. But his private life is a series of catastrophes. Every time you see him, he's going through some emotional crisis or another. But he is totally committed to representing black people as a writer. And you're going to get a chance to meet him. And I did. And everything Tom told me turned out to be very true. And that first time I met him when he came to Washington, he didn't come to Howard. And it's worth a little description. because it's very important in terms of where Jimmy stood in the discourse in this country about black people and white people. This meeting was by progressives, affluent white progressives in Georgetown, which, as you know, is the center of power and influence in DC. And it was in the house of a millionaire who used to be a socialist. It's also a very American phenomenon. And the house was sprawling, and it had no rooms in the middle, but the rooms are all on the walls going up. There was a circular staircase going up there, and all the rooms are on the wall. So the span of the house formed almost like a hall. And a group of us from Howard, and we were people in the activist movement in NAG. Stokely Carmichael was there. H. Rap Brown's brother, Ed Brown, was there. Cortland Cox was there. I was there. And a group of the young women who was working with us in NAG. But being students and being people subject to colored folks' time, we were late. And we were late because we had to walk over to Georgetown because between us we didn't have enough cab fare, right? And we get to this house, and this is what's important. I walked in, and an area as big as here, with lots of chairs. And there was little Jimmy Baldwin at the microphone. He had just been introduced. And he was about to address this audience of white people. At that time, segregation was a very real thing. And so black people and white people didn't, for the most part, meet unless it was in progressive political organizations. And so here this group of young black people get to the door. We open the door and we come in, and the whole audience, they might have been progressive white people. Well, they weren't very conservative, they weren't reactionary. And there were intellectual white people. And they had come to hear Jimmy Baldwin speak. And Jimmy looks to the door, and the group was walking. So here's a bunch of black people walking, and then the whole audience looked to the door and looked a little astonished. I mean, at that time, most of them, I would wager, were unaccustomed to being in the presence of black people with any kind of social equality. And Jimmy smiled, that beaming, illuminating, incredible smile of his. And he said, "Oh, there you are. I am so glad you got here. I'm so very glad. Come in." And that put us at ease, put the audience at ease. And Tom had said something about bursts of eloquence and intelligence. And Jimmy stood there in the presence of white America. It's the only way I can describe it. And proceeded systematically and eloquently and with incredible flair and style to demolish all the notions that dominated the discourse of race in the country. He just systematically tore them apart in such a way that you couldn't argue with them. And we sat there and we watched that audience change. They looked astonished. The things that they thought they were very familiar with, the things that they knew, Jimmy just demolished them. You think of the nigger. He said, "We didn't invent the Negro. I'm not a nigger. My brothers, my sister, my parents aren't niggers. I don't know any." So that had to have been invented by white people. And if white people invented the nigger, and I mean, this is not the kind of discussion you heard at that time, right? They had to have a reason for it. And if we look at this character, the Negro in American culture, we know what the weaknesses of the white community. And he says, you know, it's not a question. First of all, whenever they talked about us, Dr. Du Bois has an essay. What does it feel like to be a problem? Well, all references in most literary journals and discussion of race problems in the country, referred to the black community as what? The Negro problem. That was what had to be engaged. Jimmy said, I'm not a problem. And one of the ways that the Negro problem could be engaged, and a lot of the administration at Howard felt this way at that time, unfortunately, was through education. That if the Negro could only be educated to speak properly, to think properly, to read, white folks might accept us. Jimmy says, what kind of nonsense is that? It's not a question of white people accepting us, the Negro or black people. It's a question of whether we will forgive you. You are the one who committed the crimes against us, not the other way around. And he just went on systematically, much more eloquently than I'm doing it right now. But as we sat there, these are all people who would go on to Carmichael, people who would go on in SNCC to move to change the discourse in this country. We felt the ground shifting, and Jimmy single-handedly, because he was the only public intellectual at that time prepared to do that. Malcolm X might have. And we left there absolutely bound, and we were clear that the burdens, the intellectual burdens of the discourse which had been imposed on us were lifted. We never accept it anymore. So after that first meeting, after listening to Jimmy, demolish the myths and stereotypes of white discourse about us was a very, very liberating feeling. And since that time, I've been associated with Jimmy on many different areas. In the movement, he was back and forth through the South, working with us, going to demonstrations with us, writing about us. And I could talk to you about this book. How many people here, and I'm looking at the age, have read Jimmy? Good. A lot of people talk about him, and they drop their names. And one of the most annoying things is when they have these contemporary generation of black writers, and ignorant white critics are comparing them to James Baldwin. And then when you go and pick up the work of these contemporary black people, and you think of Jimmy's work, you say, what sort of ignorance is that? That's one of the reasons, by the way, why this is available to you. And if you're interested in Jimmy, take this and read it very carefully. It's a long discussion. It's the best discussion I know, and I should know because I wrote it, of Jimmy's presence and role in the discourse of this country. And they're here free of cost, and everybody should take at least one and read it very carefully. There was one moment with Jimmy that I'm going to tell you about, because it affected me very profoundly. It affected my sense of myself and my mission and my possibility as a black writer. And it's very important. But before I do that, I want to talk about this book and Jimmy's courage. Anybody familiar with this book, Price of the Ticket? It's an amazingly important book. It has Jimmy's essays from 1948 to the present, to the year he died. It's 700 pages. It's not a little book. He was writing for 40 years. I remember walking into his house in Pelham when the book came out. And Jimmy had what I remember was a tear in his eye. And he was reading this book. I said, Jimmy, how are you doing? He says, not so well, Michael. I said, what's happening? He says, I'm reading this book. stuff I wrote in 1948, and so damn little has changed. So damn little has changed, and he was upset by that. But there's one essay in this book that I want you to read, and it's an essay called The American Myth. And at that time, I'd had an experience. I had an experience back in 1964 when the March on Washington took place. I'd written an essay on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the I Have a Dream speech march, and I told the truth about it. And I talked about the role of the Kennedy administration and how at first they tried to sabotage the march, then they tried to divert it to other ways. And it wasn't a pleasant narrative, but it was true. I had been around, I watched it, I talked to people, I talked to Bayard and people working with Bayard who organized the march. And then what happened? Kennedy gets himself shot. Now, I wrote this essay for the people in the movement, and the people in Springfield loved it. But somehow it got to France, and President African, that Africanist entity that had a magazine in France, a very influential magazine, had agreed to publish it. And I didn't even know at the time what President African was, but I found out. I got this letter from them. They were going to publish this essay on the march. And I'm a sophomore in college, right? I said, good, my career is moving forward. Then I got a letter from them saying, in light of the sad and tragic circumstances of President Kennedy's death, we don't think we can publish this essay because of what it says about him. And so it doesn't say anything about him. It says nothing about President Kennedy. It talks about his administration and the reality of his political life isn't affected by the tragedy of his death. But if you don't want to publish it, don't publish it. And I didn't have a copy, so I thought that piece was lost forever. About 5 or 6 years later, somebody came to me and said, have you seen the latest issue of President African? I said, no, don't talk to me about them. And when we looked, they had published the March on Washington essay 5 years after Kennedy was dead. Why am I telling you that story?
Do you mind if I just turn the volume up a little bit? There's some folks in the back that are having trouble hearing.
Sure.
Let's see. Test for me again. Whoop, a little bit feedback.
They hear that.
Here, let's see.
Can you hear me now, folks?
Is that better?
I'm sorry about that. You should
Okay.
have spoke sooner, you know. So why was I telling you that story? Because the experience was very real to me. And when I was reading this book, there was a long, beautiful essay that Jimmy wrote about a book called Raintree County, which was being hailed in white American literary circles as the great American novel. And it talked about a lot of American history, but from such a trivial, self-aggrandizing, contemporary perspective that what it had to say about American history and culture and the myths of American society was quite useless. But the whole literary world was praised in this book. And that's the essay I want you to read. Find this book, look for the essay called The American Myth, and you'll see a number of things. You'll see the incredible brilliance of Jimmy. I mean, you don't have to have read the book, but as Jimmy discussed it, you can see it taking place, and you can see how it fit into American white discourse. And I will read you a few sections. But what's interesting about this? Jimmy was 22 years old when he wrote it. And the brilliance of the essay will leap out at you. But not only was he 22 years old, from very poor circumstances in Harlem, and he was gay, and one job he got was in the mailroom of the Daily News. And the guy who ran the mailroom, and you know, that's at the bottom of the thing, was an old Puerto Rican guy who retired. And Jimmy said, oh, well, maybe I'll be promoted to run the mailroom. That was not to be. And he had tried, as I saw it looking at this book, he had tried to get jobs with black newspapers, the Afro-American and the other, and they laughed him out of the office. Why would they do that? Here is a black guy from Harlem who didn't go to college, much less graduate, and is working as a shoeshine boy. And he has the nerve to come in here and want to be a writer. So they wouldn't hire him. And he said he was very pained by that. So he didn't really have any position of strength or influence to engage the system. But he writes this essay, this extraordinary essay. And there's a guy he talks about named Saul Levitas, who was the editor of a progressive journal called The New Leader. And Levitas used to send him books to review, said, you're very smart. And that's the only way he could get published. This black, poor, shoeshine boy from Harlem who never went to college. It's publishing this stuff. But I was reading through it, I said, whoa, what a brilliant essay. And I checked the dates, and I asked him later, he said, I was 22 when I wrote it. I said, wow. And then what happens? Just like Kennedy, that's why I recognized it. Levitas, not Levitas, the guy who wrote it, Ross, whatever his name was, Ross Lockridge, kills himself. Here's a guy whose book has just won the National Book Award. The whole literary establishment is praising him. And he goes into his garage, turns on his car, and asphyxiates himself with carbon monoxide. So what do you suppose happens? Remember what President African did to me. Obviously, Saul Levitas calls up Jimmy and said, Jimmy, we can't publish this. I mean, this guy's dead. He killed himself. We can't publish this essay. I said, unless you want to add to it, write an addendum. And Jimmy wrote an addendum which didn't take back anything he said, because everything he said was true, and just said, well, we're sorry that the guy is dead, but the book is here, and we've got to deal with the book. In his lifetime, Ross Lockridge came across a great many words, and in Raintree County, he has set down every one of them. That's how it begins. 22 years old. It follows from this that his reading was prodigious. Apparently, almost every volume of American history ever published, and most of the best, and much of the mediocre, and some of the worst, writing of past epochs and our own, have found expression in this book. He heard and remembered almost every folk song, ballad, doggerel verse, which can be called American. He accepted a really remarkable zest, all of the best American sentiments, and practically listed all the old familiar aims and concepts. His book is American and banal and brave and cheerful as a battle hymn of the Republic. There's a story about that too, which in fact it resembles to an appalling degree. And since Raintree County is not nearly so concise, it is a good deal more difficult to get through without gagging. Mr. Lockridge then is concerned with America. Incorporating the nature of the American myth between the covers of any novel is admittedly a gigantic task, and is made almost impossible by the fact that so many versions of the same myth are used for so many warring purposes. Which America will you have? There is America for the Indians, which Mr. Lockridge mentions hastily and drops. There is America for the people who settle the country, concerning whom Mr. Lockridge is vehemently lyrical, with no more startling than a Thanksgiving hymn. There's American for the laborer, for the financier, America of the North and South, and he goes on. And he says, say the book goes on, I mean, read the essay. It's a really incredibly brilliant essay. The following remarks were appended by Mr. Baldwin after the announcement of the startling suicide of Ross Lockridge Jr. The death, this is Jimmy, of Ross Lockridge of carbon monoxide poison on the night of March 6, wrote the grisliest possible finale to his ambitious novel. The newspaper accounts reported his suicide as a result of a complete breakdown from overwork. He put his whole heart into the book, we are told, and suffered a complete breakdown. Overworked suicides are by no means rare in what is known as the literary world. The history of writing has crammed the vignettes of the lonely, starving artist rushing gratefully to death. But this is not the kind of thing one expects from a young, superbly successful novelist that goes on a bestseller list, National Book Award, and being praised all over the literary world. Certainly not the kind of thing predicted for the author of the great American novel. And the question as to why Ross Lockridge killed himself is never really answered. But I think I could speculate pretty intelligently, even though his book was being so widely praised, that he began to see the superficiality and triviality of his attempt to look at American culture. But the essay wasn't really about Lockridge. The essay was about the book. It was about Americans' relationship to his culture. It was about America's relationship to its myths. And it was about the self-aggrandizing and exculpatory arguments that white America then and white America now, make America great again, has imposed on a baleful and tragic history. When he was 22 years old, Jimmy was engaged in that with great courage. And as you know,
Professor Baldwin, could you please talk closer to the microphone? We can't hear you today. Thank you.
sorry. And as we know, Jimmy was gay. He wrote his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, got some literary acclaim, got an award from a literary foundation, and went to France. He also developed a lot of supporters, well, a few supporters, a number of supporters, hailing this young black writer and wanting to make sure that he didn't make any mistakes and that his career progressed and that Jimmy prospered in the literary world. So Jimmy goes to France and comes up with his second novel. Who knows what his second novel is? Giovanni's Room. And if you know that Giovanni's Room is an extraordinarily lyrical, beautifully written, powerful book about a love affair between two men. Now, if you know what the discourse in American culture was about black people back in those days, then you have some idea what the discourse was about gay people and homosexuality. Probably the worst thing that you could accuse anybody of, certainly a young black writer, was being gay. And his advisors and supporters in this country wanted to keep that from the literary world, wanted to keep that from the publishing houses, and said, Jimmy, absolutely not. You can't publish this book. It will destroy your career. The poor black shoeshine boy who never went to college said, if you want your career to proceed, throw that manuscript away, drop it. You can't publish a book about homosexual love in this country at this time. So what did Jimmy do? What did Jimmy do? He found a French publisher. And the book came out to great acclaim. And it was picked up by American publishers. So he survived that. And the courage that it took. I mean, I think, had I been in Jimmy's circumstances, then I might have been willing to stifle the manuscript. Jimmy wasn't about to do that, and he wasn't about to deny his sexuality and his nature, and that required extraordinary amount of courage from a young man in that circumstance that I've been describing to you. And that courage went on. Look, if you get this book, 40 years of nonfiction. These are essays, political essays, cultural essays, critical essays. And it's a lot, and the type isn't big, see? So there's thousands and thousands of words in here. You can't find a sentence in those 40 years that is an embarrassment to black people. You can't find a paragraph that tries to diminish us, that tries to reduce us, that tries to evoke any of the mythology that white people have about us. And for Jimmy to do that for 40 years and to succeed and to make a career is another example of extraordinary and interesting integrity and courage. Now, I haven't really said much about his literary genius. But when I met him at Howard, he had come back from Europe to publish Another Country, which became a bestseller and a controversial book. It's a novel. And he brought back with him another book of essays, Nobody Knows My Name, to go with Notes from a Native Son. And those two books, the two books of essays, have some of the most extraordinary literary and political writing that the country ever produced. And a host of critics started to call Jimmy the greatest prose stylist the country ever created, one of the most serious public intellectuals the country ever produced. They praised him highly. He never would get any awards from this country, but they praised him very, very highly. And Jimmy said of that, you know, I begun to realize that there was a price of the ticket, that I was being invited to very highfalutin places, to the institutes, to the literary heights of white culture. But he said, I didn't see anybody I knew at those tables. My mother, my father, my family were sitting at those tables. And I began to understand very quickly that the price of my being there was a certain kind of silence. He was expected. And I saw writers say that to Jimmy. He was on a public forum on television with a bunch of writers, best-selling white American writers. And one of them leaned over and said to Jimmy, Jimmy, what are you so angry about? You've made it. You have no reason to be angry. And Jimmy told me later, he says, writers who do that are not really writers. It wasn't about his making it that was at issue, but changing the discourse and changing the circumstances of his people. I only have 10 minutes. So, but I'm not too distressed by that. And I'm not too distressed by that because you have this. And it's got everything in there that I didn't have a chance to tell you today. You get this and read it. It's here and it's free. Get it and read it. And then go read Jimmy. The Fire Next Time is one of the greatest essays published in this country, in literary terms, in political terms. And those two books, Nobody Knows My Name and Notes of a Native Son, are books you should read. And then there are a host of other books. Jimmy wrote a lot. There's all this stuff in this book that you should read. And then you can see why the comparisons between Jimmy and these Johnny-come-lately black writers are really inadequate. The next year at Howard, and I'm not going to talk about the time Jimmy spent in Amherst, because a lot of that is in this book and what I learned from him. And I got a chance to spend 2 or 3 years intimately in his company after being in touch with him through the movement in the earlier years. But we had a group at Howard called Project Awareness. And we couldn't bring radicals to the campus. And the reason we couldn't bring them was because the Congress paid a large part of Howard's operating expenses. And the committee that dealt with the Howard University budget was made up of nothing but white Southerners. They're Dixiecrats, segregationists, and they would always invite President Nabret or President Johnson in to harass them about what was happening at Howard University. They wanted him to fire leftists on the faculty. Mordecai Johnson refused. They wanted them to close down the black student activists. They said, they're not our people. We never could understand why NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group, could never get recognized by Howard. Every year, it was a big issue on campus, and we organized the students, we organized the campus, but they would never recognize NAG. They recognized the NAACP, the French Club, the Latin Club, but the Nonviolent Action Group never. And we used to cuss the administration as being backward. But they weren't backward, they were smarter than we were. When President Johnson would go to Howard, go down to Capitol Hill to defend the budget, these Southern congressmen would say, Mr. President, what's all this mess we see around DC every year with all these students from Howard, this NAG group, attacking everybody and attacking everything? And Dr. Johnson would say, the NAG group? You know, sir, I've gone through all the recognized student activities at Howard. And there's no organization called NAG at Howard. NAG don't belong to us. It must be those radical white people over at Georgetown and George Washington who say, NAG is no Howard group. No, sir. We can't take any responsibility for it. And they never stopped us from doing what we were doing. So we had this forum called The Responsibility of the Black Writer. And we invited Jimmy, and Jimmy, of course, came. We invited Lorraine Hansberry, but she was sick. She couldn't come. She would have. We invited Ralph Ellison, who wanted to have nothing to do with us, which didn't surprise anybody. But that actor, Pearlie Victorious. Huh? No. This actor, you know, he was married to this lady who's also an actress, very Huh? No. Hmm? Who? Ben. You know who I mean. Huh? No. This is a very, very prominent, well-known guy. I can't remember his name. But he came. And so the students nominated me to be on the panel. They said, look, you're the editor of the newspaper, you're a writer, you should be on that panel. So I was up on this panel with these people, you know. The guy I'm talking about went to Howard too. Huh? Who? I can't hear. Huh? No. But look up Pearlie Victorious and see who wrote it and starred in it and directed it. But anyway, after the event, it was a really interesting event because Sidney Poitier came. We didn't invite him, he was not. But he came because he saw that Jimmy was going to be on a panel discussing black literature. And we're walking through the audience and they were discovering a hat pulled on over his eyes. And we were saying, ain't that Sidney? Hey, bro. Yeah, he was there. And you know who else was there? Malcolm X. Malcolm X came in the audience. I said, what are you doing here, bro, Malcolm? He says, whenever this little brother speak, I always go if I can because I always learn something. The little brother being Jimmy. So after the event, we went over to Cortland's apartment. I don't know how many of you know anything about DC, but they had very backward laws about alcohol. And after about 6 or 7 o'clock, no alcohol could be bought in the city. But of course, black people living there could recognize an opportunity because there's a lot of black bootleggers all over DC. And if you wanted a drink after the bars closed, that's where you had to go. So a group of students, and we were amazed at how these people, Davis, Ozzie Davis, that's who it was. A group of us went to this apartment. Jimmy was there. Ozzie Davis was there. John Killens was here. John Killens, who wrote Youngblood. His son went to Howard, so we invited him. He was there in the apartment. And there was one other. Who was the other person I was talking about? Yeah, okay, I see you. I'm wrapping up. And at the end, so at a certain point, the liquor runs out. So we send somebody out to a bootlegger. They come back with some more liquor, we keep talking. And the sun is going up in Washington. And all of us students are really extraordinarily touched by the respect that these elders gave us, these celebrities, because they knew us as a sitting students, right? And they were trying to protect us and tell us what the society could do to us and what might happen to us. But at the end, we're breaking up. And all of that is to get to this point. And Jimmy got up and says, well, my young brothers and sisters, where are we? Because we spent the whole night discussing the movement and the struggle and the backlash that everybody thought was coming and what could happen. And Jimmy says, where does that leave us? He says, "Here I am, Jimmy Baldwin, a black writer," and I can quote him exactly. "By virtue of which fact, I somehow represent you." Now, I never asked for that, and you never elected me, but by virtue of this fact, I represent you. And I want to make a deal with you. He's talking to the students. He says, if you promise me that you will never, ever accept any of the reductive and condescending and insulting terms of reference which this society has ready to impose on you. If you promise me you will never accept that, and I can speak for the students in that room, none of us ever have. He said, I can promise you that I, James Baldwin, will never abandon you, will never betray you. And he never did. He never did. And he had that sense of representing us and trying to inspire us to have principles and courage. And that lasted his entire life till the year he died. And Dancer went to join the ancestors. And he was an extraordinary literary genius. This book talks about the political attacks that he had to suffer, literary political attacks, and how pointless they are. You get a hold of this essay and read it carefully. And since Ed Cohen has been flashing signs in my face telling me I'm out of time, I was gonna talk a little bit about Ed, but since I'm out of time, I remember when Ed was an undergraduate student, and he had a sponsor. There was a member of the faculty who really developed a great admiration for Ed and took him under her wing. You have any idea who that was? Dr. Shirley Graham Du Bois. And she kept telling us about Ed, and you must meet Ed Cohen, and Ed Cohen is a very promising young man, and if Mr. Bois was around today, sir, she would be proud of you. Thank you.
Right, lots of time to mingle. So we have snacks out there. Actually, we
Painting, and keep an eye on information about her, because she is a rising star in the art world. Good. Sorry. You want to come up and say something?
Hi, I'm Ayana Pierre Maxwell. I'm a freshman at the University of Miami, but I used to live in Springfield. I used to come here all the time when I was little, so I'm glad to be back, and I'm very honored to have painted this portrait for Ed. So thank you.